Good afternoon. My name is Dave Fowler. I'm a senior project manager with the Association of State Floodplain Managers. I'm hoping you're enjoying the 2021 virtual ASFPM conference as much as I am. I'm learning a lot and the presentations have been fantastic. And we're going to continue that with our session H6, Green Infrastructure and Living Shorelines for Coastal Flood Mitigation. And to start us off with that, we have Jannek Cederberg from Cummins and Cederberg Incorporated. He's going to be speaking on waterfront parks, sea level rise, and flooding adaptations. Jannek is a coastal engineer with over 20 years of experience in planning and design and coastal and marine projects through Southeast Florida. With that, Jannek, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jannek Cederberg. I'm principal of Cummins Cederberg. We are a coastal and marine engineering firm based here in Florida. We're here to talk about sea level rise adaptation projects in Miami, and specifically using one project that we worked on as a case study. So let me share my screen. So to give you some background about our firm first, as I mentioned, we are a coastal marine engineering firm, so all our projects is in that environment. So sea level rise adaptation is right over our alley. It includes a lot of the components we would normally have in our typical projects. Our team consists of coastal engineers, marine structure engineers, marine biologists, permit specialists, oceanographers, and also construction specialists. So this is really a great team, and what you need when you're looking at sea level rise adaptation projects, because it's so interconnected between disciplines that is that you kind of need to consider everything. We have offices throughout Florida, so basically covering the entire state. So as I mentioned, our sort of projects is spread within the coastal marine environment. So that could be piers or marina seawalls, or analysis of coastal process, wave propagation studies, hurricane analysis, beach erosion studies, and then also the required environmental fieldwork, seagrass monitoring or mapping, coral relocation, and also environmental permitting with the various agencies. I'm going to use a specific project as a case study here to illustrate our approach, but the coastal resiliency space is an area we are very, very familiar and comfortable in. We worked on a lot of different types of projects with municipalities and also county. As well as very remote places, for example, in the Caribbean, on islands far away from everything, where you don't have FEMA flood maps or established water levels and that kind of things, but basically sitting in the middle of the ocean and need to make sure that your island is still there after a hurricane. Also worked on critical infrastructure facilities such as like water treatment, wastewater treatment plants, for example. So the project that I'm going to talk about is the Madison Hammock Park. So as mentioned, we are in the Miami area. So we're in South Florida, and we are in part of Miami that's not the beach part. The beach part is this area here, which is the South Beach area. But this here is more of a Back Bay area. So this is a shoreline mostly of mangroves and similar, and slightly more protected, but very high, still exposed to hurricane. That highest water level actually during Hurricane Andrew was right around here, which was 17 feet in GVD. So as I mentioned, this area here is it's a lot of vegetation, but it's also primarily private owned. So a few areas where access actually to the bay for the public. So we have mast and hammock here, but then you can see if you go southwards, it's very limited in terms of locations. And then it's a little bit more open when you go northwards. But so besides actually access to the water, Madison Hammock is also the first park when you're coming from south, where you basically have a beach, besides this one all the way down in Homestead, which is much, much further southwards. So if you're living in this part of Miami, Madison Hammock is a very, very important place for you. If you want to go to the beach, because it's much closer, for example, than South Beach or Key Biscayne. So the park itself has many different components, actually many components that you also find like in smaller communities, which makes it very interesting. So it's like a beach area here, which is kind of protected, this little atoll pool with a ribbon around it. There's a restaurant back here, big parking lot. A lot of mangroves. There's a trail through the mangroves going all the way up to the main road. There's a marina that goes all the way here. We're a little dockmaster building here. We have boat ramps over here with a parking lot as well. So you can see from this photo, it is relatively low lying. And I see this here is a photo from when we were out there one day, where we actually captured, I believe this was tourists going through, and I'm guessing from the car, it appears to be a German tourist going through like several inches of water, which all this is salt water, so definitely not good for the car. But as you can see, this here is a sunny day. This is just tidal flooding in the park. Some other areas here, this is the mangrove trail that I mentioned that goes up to the main road. You see very low line. And this here is not like the worst tidal day. Like we had days where we had slightly higher as well. You can see how low it is, and basically inundated sometime, preventing use of it unless you want to walk through water. This here is one of the parking areas. You can see how the water is there as well, several inches. This is the tall area with the remnant around the beach here. This here was after Hurricane Irma, so it was damaged a little bit, but you can see how flooded it is here. And then we have the beach area here. You see the beach is behind here, completely like inundated on a normal day. Example of the seawalls, like one to the left, you can see very low lying seawalls. They have a lot of different stretches of seawalls here, different years of construction. You can see this one here, the water basically up to the top of the cap. You also see water in here in the parking lot behind it. Whereas this one here has several feet more of freeboard. This here is the boat ramp area. You also see the flooding here and flooding the overflow parking here behind there as well. And more flooding of the roads. So already very, very impacted from flooding. So the first thing that we do when we work on these kind of studies here is to get topographic information, and LiDAR data is really, really a good resource for that. It provides you a lot of information very efficiently, and most of the time you can actually get it for free. A lot of time you can find it from different public sources. So what you see here is the red areas, the low areas, and then green the higher ones. So we have the road coming down. There's the main road out here. So the road coming through the park here, and then splitting towards the boat ramps here, and the marina here, and the atoll pool over here. So you see, for example, here the boat ramp, we have like these lower lying areas that are orange reddish, where we saw ponding of water. The same on this parking lot over here and at the beach. This is a seawall that I showed you that was almost flooded. This here is the other seawall with several feet more freeboard, where you can see this is green and higher. If we look at the different components in the park, then basically this here shows you the minimum and average and maximum elevation of each component. And then we have shown the published mean high water elevation here. But you see the average elevation is right around here, like 2.5, 3 feet. So not too high. So the next thing we did was look at the condition of all these pieces of infrastructure. They're all built at different time and have different service life. And the key is to, when you're looking at sea level rise adaptation, you want to do it in a smart way. So you don't want to rebuild a seawall that is brand new, for example. You want to go in and pick out the components where you need to do replacement anyway, and then you can go in and when you rebuild it, you can adjust the elevation, for example. If you have to rebuild a seawall and you build it 1 foot higher, the incremental cost is minimal. But if you go into an existing seawall and want to do it, the cost is going to be much, much higher. So basically here you see like we mapped the condition and remaining service life of all these different components. And this really forms the basis of our plan that I'll show you later on. Then we also looked at the environmental resources in the park. We have a lot of mangroves around here, and you can see here this is a mangrove. This is a trail through the mangroves where we have the mangroves coming all the way up, and also start going into the asphalt there. And that's definitely something that they want to make sure they do proper maintenance, so you don't start getting resources such as mangroves growing in areas where you don't want them to grow, and then suddenly you have to do mitigation for them, for example. We also looked at seagrass. You can see we have some here. So if we want to expand the revetment, we have to consider that we don't impact that too. Next thing we looked at is water levels. So this here is published tidal water levels from a nearby station. You see mean high water level at mean high water at 0.2 feet in AVD. This here shows the predicted tidal levels over a year. You can see here the tidal variations here by month that we have. But there's also, if you look at over an annual basis, that we have some areas, part of the year where it's lower, and then we have these like higher months here, which is kind of popularly referred to as a king tide events, where you can see it's much, much higher. So what I showed you before was the predicted directly tidal values, but we want to compare them then with actually observed value. And that's what you see here. So the blue you see here is the same blue as you saw before, and then the black one in the background, that's actually actual measurements. And you can see in general, most of the time the measurements are actually much higher, which could be due to like local dynamics or regional dynamics. For example, this park here is facing east, and we typically have like an eastern wind, so it can be wind set up, for example, that is generating like a higher water level that is not related to the tide. But the interesting thing is that, for example, here where we have like a very high tide event, that it's almost like more than a foot higher than your actually predicted tidal elevation. So that's very important, because when you work on a project, you want to make sure you design on the actual condition and not basically what the conditions are on paper, the theoretical conditions. So that's important, both from like when we look at the water levels, but also when you look at drainage, for example, tailwater conditions, that you consider that. So this here shows basically the same data you just saw, but relative to exceedance. So you have the exceedance here, and then the elevation here. And you can see we plotted the mean high water line here. This is 0.2 feet, and you see this basically exceeded almost 20% of the time, and you have seen much higher water levels during some periods. So the other side of water level is then the actual sea level rise. So this here shows the projections from the South Florida Climate Compact that came out in 2015. And for this study here, we had adopted this curve here, which is a higher curve from the US Army Corps. But just to illustrate how dynamic these type of projects is, and after we finished the study, and a new projection came out that was slightly higher. So that just shows you that when you develop these kind of plans, you need to make sure you have flexibility in your plan and in your design. and you don't want to go too much in detail with things that likely may change every 5 years. So then we took all the water level info and basically saw how that applied to the park. So what you see is the inundation basically from now and on to 2100, and where you can where we slowly increase the water level, and you see that it's very dramatic. Basically, the park is going to be inundated here by the end of the century unless something is done. So obviously very, very dramatic, and it shows that the county needs to do something. This is kind of the same information, just like by numbers. And you see here, 98% of it in 100 will be inundated unless they do something. But also importantly, we look at the numbers where we are already, that's already doing king tide. There's a large amount of the park that is inundated. Next step we look at was start looking at specific components. So this here shows you the trail through the mangroves, where we look at elevation. So we start here at the road, and then it goes through to the mangroves areas, and then down to the tall area in the parking lot down there. So you can see we have some very low areas there that are already below the published mean high water line, which is, as I mentioned, lower than a lot of the actual water levels. We also mapped that relative to elevation and length of below a certain elevation, and also here a percentage. So the county, for example, if they wanted to do an interim solution and want to get like these small areas here up, had a minimum of 0.3 feet, for example, then you can see it's 1,000 feet of a trail that they would need to improve. We did a similar thing for the roads. And you see the top one shows the main road. I start up here. There's very high elevation. There's a high ridge going through Dade County in this area. But then it drops very quickly as we get into the park around 2 feet. The bottom one shows like the secondary road that goes to where the road splits and go to the boat ramps. We have a bridge here. You can see very low lying, and important for bridges is also something we're talking to FDOT about, is that when you start considering sea level rise, bridges are going to get more exposed too, and falls are going to increase in that, and you're going to have reduced clearance as well. This bridge is also used by residents that use the canal that goes under the bridge, actually. So then we looked at actual concept. So what you see here is the different areas with the color representing when things need to be done. So the yellow ones are the areas recommended done within 5 years, and then orange in 2030 and blue in 2040. And this is basically based on a combination on how exposed it is now, if it's flooding now, and what condition is in relative to remaining service life. And you see we all these areas shows like cross sections where we developed proposed conditions so the county could see recommended improvements. I'm not going to go through all of them, but like one of them here, for example, let's say a tall pool where we have the existing conditions here, very low lying and low lying revetment, and then we build up to high elevation, increase the revetment for that area. So we have that for all the different areas with recommended elevation too. Then we summarized all of it in this table here. And it may look a bit confusing here on first glance, but basically what you have here is all the different areas on the left side. And then we have the year going out this way. And each color represents when one of these components is going to be replaced. And then the number inside of it is the new elevation. So this here basically provide like a roadmap of what elevation and when the county needs to do something with a specific item in a very simplistic manner for them. And obviously, as I mentioned, like sea level rise curves may change. So it may be that later on that some of these elevations are going to be changed, but you need to have a roadmap. So yeah, maybe they're going to change 6 inches, but you want to know approximately where you're going with all these things and when you have to do it, and make sure you plan it. Then we developed construction costs, also divided like same time periods, like within 5 years, 2030, 2040. And like the county obviously have to spend a bit of money. But the important thing is here that what we did is we looked at the condition of the existing infrastructure and then looked at how exposed it is. And then everything we try to do relative to sea level rise adaptation and is basically looking at what capital improvements you need to do anyway, and when do you need to do it, and then implement adaptation projects into it. So it basically each piece of infrastructure project that you're doing becomes a adaptation project, but at the time when it's right. So again, you don't want to rebuild a seawall that still have 20 years left in it. You want to rebuild it when it doesn't have any more service life, and you're already going to spend a lot of money. So the incremental cost is much, much lower. And that's really the key, but you need a roadmap for it. So you can plan that out and do the projects the right way. Another thing is that this here is a waterfront park, so it's a fairly harsh marine environment, also exposed to storms and hurricanes. So it may be that 1 year you get a particular a bad hurricane that's going to demolish a lot of things. So and then you want to have like a roadmap ready, so when that happens, that you know what you have to rebuild to, and you don't have to start all this here, going through all this here. So you want to have this ready beforehand. So when things need to be rebuilt and you may have access to funding, that you have this ready. Finally, where this has proven extremely helpful too is that the Parks Department have been able to take basically this roadmap we developed with them with cost and concepts and reasoning of why these things need to be done, and plan their grant applications a lot more effective, because they have information on what needs to be done and when it needs to be done and why it has to be done. And they can basically like copy paste concepts and the text relative to like the engineering part of it into these grant application, make very effective grant application, but also in a very cost-effective manner. So it helped them a lot there, and it has already gotten a lot of grants, and they're already implementing some of these improvements here that are recommended. And it's actually very incredible. From we started talking to the county until they actually start implementing some of these projects here was less than 3 years, which include like besides the study, all the contracts and all these kind of things, and that. So they are already doing these here projects here. We talk actually several of them they're implementing now, which is very remarkable, and really a big shout out here to the county for being like proactive in that way. So this Madison Hammock project, it was the first one that the county completed, but it also then became kind of like, as I mentioned, a pilot study for other parks in the county. So the county basically wanted to do this for all the other waterfront parks projects. So we did that for all the major ones that they have. So we basically prepared roadmaps for more than 2,000 acres of park, detailing of what needs to be done, when it has to be done, and done it in a very, very cost-effective manner. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. If you have a question, I'm here part of the panel. You can also always reach out to me if you want to read about this here. It was also included in Marina World that was very interested in this topic here and made an article about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jannek, for an excellent presentation. We do have some time for some questions. The first question is, how much is the additional cost for adaptation to sea level rise?
Thank you, Dave. Excellent question. The way that we did this here was that we tried to approach in a very pragmatic way. So a lot of times when people think about adaptation to sea level rise and they see these curves where they see like 3 feet or 4 feet of sea level rise going forward, I think that's going to be an astronomical cost. But the way that we did this here was that we tied it into the actual work that needs to be done, tied into the service life of each component. So each component that we have in the plan is going to be rebuilt anyway. So there's already a cost associated with that that's part of your normal maintenance. So we've done a lot of these studies here, our plans, and what we've done actually on several of them is that we took the alternative concept, basically saying, what if we didn't have sea level rise? What would the cost be? And what we found was that between like the non-sea level rise and the sea level rise scenario was actually only like a 10-15% cost difference for these areas here, which is an additional cost, but it's a much smaller amount than when people are typical thinking about relative to sea level rise. Obviously, some of these areas that we've looked at have been park areas. So there are some of them don't have as many stakeholders that you may find in communities. But the key point is that there's a significant cost savings if you plan it in advance and people know what you're doing. So there's time to adapt.
Thank you, Jannek. Second question, have you had difficulties getting the communities to accept climate change as a real concept and not a hoax?
Not in Miami. So this here was a project in Miami, and people see what's going on here. And in general, in Florida, we see that people are much more accepting that there is flooding occurring. Depends sometimes on how you refer to it. You can refer to it to nuisance floodings, and everybody can agree that that's not something we want. We don't want to have drive our cars through salt water. So we want to do something about that. We can show measurements of tidal elevation and basically see how high that is, and we can see some changes in that. So we haven't had too much pushback from it, but we are also very, the way that we do our projects is we try to be very applied and not going into the whole discussion in terms of how much actually sea level rise is going to be. We adopt like a projections and then include some flexibility in that. And then otherwise just try to be pragmatic about it and develop a like very applied concept that where people can see that they're experiencing flooding and they want to do something about it. So we haven't had too much pushback from that so far.
Thank you, Jannek. Another question. For the park, is the community or region discussing the option of doing nothing? This is a lot of investment for an area without a significant number of homes or houses that would better justify protection that will, and I guess the area that will ultimately be underwater in the not so distant future, regardless of any mitigation actions.
For this particular area here, we didn't discuss retreat. I think that depends very much on where you are. As I mentioned, the way that we develop this roadmap here showed that the additional cost was not astronomical. So it's something that makes sense to do here. Obviously, there's some areas in the country where it may not make sense. But Southeast Florida real estate here is fairly costly, so it makes sense to try to preserve what you have. And in the end of the day, it's really just a matter of raising your ground elevation in many areas. So it's that additional cost of fill. The complex part of it is to do it in a smart way. that's what we've been trying to do. And so it's a step-by-step process for doing that.
Thank you, Jannek. And this question you might have answered it there, but let me ask it again. With many adaptation projects planned, it sounds like most of the efforts are shoring up facilities and rebuilding. Do any of the plans include abandoning or disinvesting facilities?
We had one specific area in this park here where we that had a long road leading down to basically like a parking lot. There wasn't too much, and we provided concept of what the county could do if they wanted to maintain that, but we also said there's a significant cost with that. So it's also an area that they could potentially just use for mitigation for some other work that they're doing, because there may be mitigation required as part of some of the other parts of the projects.
Well, thank you, Jannek. I don't believe we have any other questions. I really appreciate you taking the time to make this presentation at the conference, and thank you very much. So moving on to our second session, our second presentation in this section, we've got Alaurah Moss from Dewberry talking about fortifying our coastal fortifying our coastal economies and ecosystems with living shorelines. Ms. Moss is a project manager in coastal science at Dewberry Engineering's in Virginia Beach office, and her mission is to help coastal communities understand their flood risk and vulnerabilities. With that, take it away, Ms. Moss.
Hello, and welcome to my presentation entitled Fortifying Our Coastal Economies and Ecosystems with Living Shorelines. I'm Alaurah Moss, a coastal scientist and project manager in Dewberry's Virginia Beach office. Today I'll be taking you on a virtual tour of this innovative living shoreline design project. This cover photo is a bit of a sneak peek of the completed project, but in the next few slides we'll travel back in time to the beginning of the project. Coal terminal and living shoreline are not two words you commonly hear together. So why a living shoreline? One of Norfolk Southern's main ports is Lambert's Point Coal Terminal, which is located along the Elizabeth River in Norfolk, Virginia. Lambert's Point is home to Pier 6, which is the largest and fastest rail-to-ship transloading facilities in the Northern Hemisphere, and also home to many important railway assets. This industrial riverfront generates jobs and also brings other economic benefits to our region. Norfolk Southern recognizes the advantages that the Elizabeth River brings to its operations, and for many years has worked closely with the Elizabeth River Project, a local nonprofit whose mission is to help restore and preserve the river. The partnership led to this project, and you can see the location of the project on Lambert's Point Coal Terminal highlighted in this yellow box. To begin the project, we visited the site to get our bearings, define the objectives, and also brainstorm design alternatives. Here are some smiling faces of our Dewberry project team, including Norfolk Southern's facility manager. This quote from Norfolk Southern's Chief Sustainability Officer concisely states our objectives. The project reflects our long-standing commitment to be a good community steward. We are restoring habitat that not only beautifies the shoreline and contributes to a healthy river ecosystem, but also will help protect important business assets at our terminal. We view it as a sustainability triple play. During our site visit, we documented notable site features. Before the project, broken pilings and pieces of a historical bulkhead poked above the river. The sandy beach was very narrow and abutted a nearly vertical 20-foot tall bank. The two ends of the site were more recently stabilized by a riprap revetment at one end, as well as a short wooden bulkhead on the other end. Lastly, the site has two stormwater outfalls that convey upland drainage into the river. This photo shows the site at low tide before construction. It really depicts how much erosion has taken place on the backside of the historical bulkhead. I'll show some historical aerial imageries in a few slides that depict this area completely filled in. This is a photo of a close-up of the steep bank. The bank is dominated by the common invasive grass Phragmites. It's a deep-rooted vegetation that does provide some stabilization benefits, but we did observe significant signs of erosion of the bank face as well as the toe. Our next step was data collection and analysis to inform our design. We consulted Living Shoreline design standards to account for all of the parameters that are critical for a successful design. Our analysis included both desktop as well as field data collection. The field investigation involved a bathymetric and hydrologic survey to establish depths and tidal elevations, as well as the geotechnical investigation to collect soil samples and estimate the soil bearing capacity. A geotech investigation is not common for all Living Shoreline projects, but given the large scale of this project, it was very important. The review of erosion history at the site is probably the most interesting, so I'll be focusing on that in the next few slides. Reviewing historical photos really helped us understand how the site has changed throughout time. The 1930s photo shows the shoreline stabilized by the original bulkhead. The drainage ditches that you're seeing across the site were likely necessary because filling in of the low-lying marshy area along the shore blocked the natural drainage of the site. By the late 1940s, the site had been completely filled in by dredge disposal material, and we also noted minimal vegetation. 30 years later, the 1979 photo shows that the fill still extends to the bulkhead line, except in areas that have been breached and are starting to erode away. You'll also notice a narrow beach feature that has started to form in the 1979 photo, which indicates to us that this beach was likely not a natural feature, but rather the result of erosion of that fill material over time. Fast forwarding to 2019, we can see that the shoreline has retreated significantly past the historical bulkhead line, leaving the steep exposed bank that we see today. From the historical imagery, we could clearly observe the erosion, but wanted to get a better understanding of the erosion rate. So we used GIS to do a transect-based analysis of historical shorelines from 1937, 2009, and today. The analysis revealed that from the 1930s to today, the shoreline was eroding between 0.5 foot and 1 foot per year. But between 2009 and today, we detected an acceleration in that erosion rate, in some places up to 2 feet per year, especially in the northwestern portion of the site. Envisioning a no-action alternative helped Norfolk Southern communicate to its stakeholders the need for this project. We used a design rendering software called Infra to visualize these scenarios, using the present-day erosion rate to extrapolate into the future. The top figure shows existing conditions, and the bottom shows a 30-year projection. Under the no-action scenario, an additional 1 acre of land could be lost, exposing the access road that you're seeing to flooding during extreme high tides and storm events. So our design goal was to bring back a beautiful, vibrant shoreline, but also help to mitigate future erosion. Our team developed several design alternatives, but after comparing benefits, we found that an offshore breakwater living shoreline approach would optimize the desired project benefits within the client's budget. Our living shoreline design involved several components that together create an oasis of green extending nearly 3 football fields along the industrial shoreline. The design is composed of approximately 900 feet of low-profile rock breakwaters. You'll sometimes hear these referred to as marsh sills. They're positioned offshore along the historical shoreline. The gaps that you see between the breakwaters allow access for aquatic life and also sediment nourishment of the wetland vegetation during high tides. The purpose of the marsh sills are to buffer the shoreline from wind waves and also ship wake, creating a calm, protected area. To rebuild the eroded shoreline behind the marsh sills, an engineered beach provides a gradual slope that can support tidal marsh. To accelerate the establishment of the tidal marsh system, our design called for 24,000 native marsh grass plantings. And lastly, our design called for roughly 90 cubic yards of recycled oyster shell, which would be placed on the backside of the marsh sills to create an inviting habitat for native Elizabeth River oysters, which would help to improve water quality. This slide shows a cross-section view of our design elements to better visualize the new shoreline profile. Notice that the engineered beach was designed based on the targeted tidal elevations of mean low tide, mean water level, and mean high tide. A healthy tidal marsh system is composed of diverse vegetation with different preferences for inundation. For example, the low marsh system requires regular inundation, whereas the higher marsh system only requires periodic inundation. Notice also that no modifications were proposed to the steep bank for 2 reasons. First, because of the cost to regrade the bank and plant with native vegetation. And second, because the dense, deep-rooted Phragmites grass, while invasive, still helps to hold the bank together. This area could be addressed in future phases of the project to allow for a more gradual profile of the upland bank so that the wetland vegetation can more easily migrate with rising sea levels. This slide shows a zoomed-in profile of the marsh sill. Typically, marsh sills are designed to be submerged during high tide or a storm event. However, we designed the sill to be taller to accommodate for the anticipated settlement that was detected from the geotechnical investigation, as well as to accommodate for sea level rise. Today, the sill will be 2 feet emergent at high tide, but with 1.5 feet of settlement or sea level rise, the sill would only be half a foot above high tide. Norfolk Southern has acknowledged that additional stone might be necessary to add to the sill to maintain the erosion control benefits of the project. It's also important to mention that stone sizing was selected to withstand wave and water levels associated with a larger 25-year coastal storm event. While the marsh sills would be completely submerged during this event, the rocks were sized to withstand this level of inundation. At the 95% design stage, we assisted Norfolk Southern in preparing and submitting permit applications. As this occurred during COVID-19 pandemic, this kept the permitting agencies from completing their required site visit prior to issuing the permits. Instead, we creatively developed this virtual site visit package by going out to the site and staking out the regulatory boundaries so that the agencies could easily see the project extent in relation to important jurisdictional thresholds such as low tide and high tide. Following the design phase, we helped Norfolk Southern oversee construction of the project to make sure it was built according to the design plans and specifications. Construction took about 3 months and began in May of 2020. Construction started by installation of a turbidity curtain, which you can see in the second photo, to help manage sediment during construction. The next step was placement of the breakwaters or marsh sills. And then the next step was placement of the engineered beach, which took roughly 200 dump truck loads of sand. And then the last step was planting of the wetland vegetation. Our drone photographer captured a bird's eye flyover of the site after construction. This footage is being used for public outreach and engagement, as well as to serve as a baseline to monitor how the project evolves over time. Since this footage was taken, the wetland plantings have already started to establish and become much more dense. So I'll play this video and make a few remarks. You'll notice that the breakwaters are creating a calm environment with less wave action. However, in the gaps between the breakwaters, there is higher wave transmission, which is leading to the forming of these pocket beach features. As I mentioned before, the wetland vegetation you're seeing here has just been planted and has already started to become more dense and green over time. You'll also notice the oyster shell that was placed on the back side of the marsh sills. We've noticed since establishment a few oysters that have recruited onto this new habitat. You'll also notice fencing surrounding the marsh planting area. This is designed to keep out waterfowl. We're also supporting Norfolk Southern with the 5 years of post-construction monitoring that's required by the permits. The monitoring plan we developed establishes specific monitoring goals and objectives. The overarching goals are to establish a healthy tidal habitat, ensure the marsh sill structures showed no significant damage or deterioration over time, and also reduce the rate of erosion of the steep bank. For each of these objectives, we identified evaluation metrics and success criteria to enable consistent tracking across the monitoring years. The first report was complete in September of 2020, just after construction was complete, and helps to establish baseline conditions to compare against in the subsequent years. I'm happy to report that the shoreline successfully endured its first large storm in October of last year. In closing, I wanted to highlight that earlier this year, Norfolk Southern took the grand prize at an Elizabeth River Project event that recognizes businesses that voluntarily restore wildlife habitat and reduce pollution. This project is one of the region's largest living shoreline projects created by a business on the riverfront, and hopefully will serve as a great model for others on how living shorelines can accomplish multiple community benefits. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for listening. If you're interested in getting in touch, please feel free. Our contact information is listed here. Thank you.
Thank you, Alaurah. That was a fascinating presentation on Norfolk. I've actually had the opportunity to go there and talk about some of the issues the Navy base is having with sea level rise. So this was a fascinating presentation. And before I jump to the questions, I really liked the use of the drone. The drone really gave a good view of the what was happening and how it looks and how it's growing. And I'm hoping that the client really liked, I think, what you did there, and you could show it to him with that drone footage. It seems like something very interesting to use. But,
yeah, thanks, David. We hope to get future drone imagery during the post-construction monitoring to see how things change over time. Before diving into the questions, I'd like to introduce Adam Motzinger, who is joining me today for the Q&A session. Adam is from Norfolk Southern's Environmental Operations section, located in Charlotte, North Carolina. And Adam and I have been working together on this project since construction was complete. And we're also working together on the post-construction monitoring effort. So with that, do we have any questions?
yes, we've got questions coming in. The first one is, what other design alternatives were considered for the site?
Yeah, sure. I can start, and then Adam, if you have anything to add. So during the preliminary design phase, we did consider several other options. The first was a joint planted revetment, I call it. That would basically involve regrading that steep embankment and then stabilizing either the toe or the entire slope with riprap stone. And then it could be planted with native vegetation in between the stones. And while that was considered a living shoreline approach, it really would provide significantly less habitat and be equally as costly as the option we went with. And then we also considered a combination of regrading that steep bank with a revetment in addition to the offshore breakwater system. But as you can imagine, that was the most costly option. And then the last thing I'll mention is that for the option that we went with, the offshore breakwater system, we did consider several different types of materials for building the breakwaters, like oyster castles and reef ball structures, but ended up going with that riprap stone, as Norfolk Southern really felt it would be the most aesthetically pleasing option and also kind of tied in well with their existing shoreline aesthetic.
All right, our second question is actually three questions. Were project partners at the state or federal level involved in project design or implementation?
I would say that during the permitting process, absolutely. It involved the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences authorization, as well as the Department of Environmental Quality, and then the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers provided feedback during the permitting process.
What permitting parameters enabled and or hindered the project's timeline?
That's a good question. Permitting parameters. Well, luckily, I mean, during the COVID pandemic, we were concerned that the permitting process would be slowed down. But luckily, the agencies were accepting of our virtual site visit package, so that really didn't seem to slow down anything. And we had a little bit of back and forth with the post-construction monitoring approach, but that process also didn't take too long.
Dave, I think they're, if I could jump in, I think their client, the railroad, was maybe more of a slowdown as we battled for budget support and looked at all of our different options. So we really appreciate the patience that Dewberry had and the regulatory community as we got our ducks in a row. So.
Thank you. And then the last part of that three-part question was, were the oysters seeded?
Mm.
No, they were not. Just oyster shells were placed on the backside. We haven't observed any significant movement of the shells, which has been a pleasing result. And then, Adam, I think the Elizabeth River project's considering some experimental oyster seeding approaches, right?
That's correct. We're looking at sort of a phase 2 of this project where we would establish some oyster reclamation beds on the backside of the living shoreline. So this project has been a really exciting one for us, and we're looking forward to the opportunities that it presents us to continue to, I guess, re-nourish this area.
And then, oops, I lost the questions for a minute. And then, are the pocket beaches formed desirable, or are they considered an issue that will need to be addressed? If they need to be addressed, what is the plan?
Yeah, those pocket beaches are typical. It's what we would expect with any kind of offshore breakwater system that has gaps. Those are the areas where there's higher wave transmission, so you're going to have higher erosion. So it was intentional, and it won't be addressed through nourishment.
And what factors were used to determine the width of the gaps between the sills?
We referred to the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences Living Shoreline Design Guidance document, and we went with that standard in the document. I suppose you could also use numerical modeling to really refine that number.
All right, I don't think we have any other questions coming in. I'll give it a few minutes here, but Alaurah and Adam, thank you for an excellent presentation. That looks like a really great project. I love the living shoreline. We're trying to bring that concept to Lake Michigan so far with limited success. So I thought it was a great project. So thank you very much. And then moving along to our third and final presentation of this session, we have Millicent Crawford and Len Matterman. They're going to be talking about beyond local boundaries, local and regional sea level rise adaptation strategies on the San Francisco Peninsula. And Millie is a senior engineer in water resource management and planning at Woodard and Curran. And Len is the San Mateo County Flood and Sea Level Rise Resiliency District CEO. So with that, please take it away.
Welcome to Beyond Local Boundaries, a regional sea level rise adaptation strategies for the San Francisco Bay Area. My name is Len Matterman. I'm the CEO of the San Mateo County Flood and Sea Level Rise Resiliency District. With me presenting today is Millie Cowley-Crawford, a project manager with Woodard and Curran. Also partners in our project are the City of Burlingame, led on the project by its Public Works Director, Syed Martuza, and the City of Millbrae, led by its Public Works Director, Key Lim. In California, San Mateo County is on the San Francisco Peninsula, and it is the poster child for sea level rise vulnerability in the state. Within the state, it's the county that's most vulnerable in terms of population, including underrepresented population, property value, the number of homes, and the number of contaminated sites to the first 3 feet of sea level rise. And for this area of vulnerability, it's only one of 6 counties in the U.S. and the only one on the West Coast that has 100,000 people at risk. So we have a substantial vulnerability in our county. Solving the county's climate change related challenges are massive. The challenge to solve them is massive. On 2 coastlines, we have the Pacific coastline, shown on the left side of this picture, and San Francisco Bay on the right side. We had a long-standing flood control district, which was insufficient to address this monumental challenge. It was insufficient because it only covered 10% of the county land in terms of property tax revenue and in terms of projects, and it only covered about 10% of the bay shoreline and none of the Pacific coastline. Because of this, and because we know that the regional, solving this regional problem needs the work of all cities and that they cannot do it alone, and because the cities themselves are not well positioned to secure state and federal funding, to secure land rights, and to secure environmental permits. That we needed to create an approach that looked at the scale of the challenge and took the philosophy that we're all in this together. In terms of regional sea level rise and the challenge, the bay itself has risen about 8 inches in the last about 125 years. Future estimates vary, of course, for sea level rise. The county vulnerability assessment looked at various scenarios of the 100-year FEMA floodplain plus 1 meter, or 3.3 feet, and the FEMA floodplain plus 2 meters. The focus of our agency is to address the challenge related to the 100-year floodplain plus approximately 6 feet. And that's equal to 10 feet above today's daily high tide. So we're not as worried about these different graph lines and what kind of the different vulnerabilities could be depending on various scenarios and various time scales, whether it's 2050 or 2100. We're just focused on a particular number of feet, and we're taking what is currently a very aggressive approach of looking at 10 feet above today's high tide. So here are some steps in how long it took to build this agency. In 2013, there was a countywide meeting, and SFO was mapped in San Francisco Airport, International Airport, was mapped into FEMA's special flood hazard area. In 2015, the county created something called Sea Change San Mateo County, and SFO began its project to address its bay water vulnerability. Between 2015 and 2018, San Mateo County did a vulnerability assessment, which had the results that I spoke earlier about the county's substantial vulnerability to this issue. And in 2018, the county began to provide grants to local jurisdictions to study their vulnerability. 2 of those grants went to the 2 cities just to the south of San Francisco Airport. They're called Millbrae and Burlingame. And in 2019, the city of Burlingame completed its study. And in 2020, the city of Millbrae completed its study. So we had San Francisco Airport, or SFO, doing its project. Immediately to the south, the city of Millbrae was doing a study and completed it about a year ago this month. And immediately to the south of Millbrae, a different city was doing a study. And meanwhile, the district was formed, this countywide district of flood and sea level rise resiliency district, to look at the water-related impacts of climate change. So it made sense that one of our early projects at the district would be to bring together these various studies that acknowledged their neighbors and the issues that they face and how it relates to each of them. But they didn't align or connect these projects in any way. So it made sense for the district to do that. In order for us to be successful, we've needed elected champions at multiple levels of government. We needed a compelling argument for why a new entity should be created, and bringing together 2 cities and a major asset like an international airport is that justification. As well as the opportunity to acquire external funding. And we needed committed local officials from different jurisdictions so that we had buy-in from all 20 cities in the county and the county itself for this new government agency. Now I'm going to turn it over to Millie to speak about the studies of the 2 cities and how the details of this project came to be. Millie?
Thanks, Len. So what we've seen so far is that it really is imperative to address the local challenges of sea level rise as a region from a planning and funding perspective, but it's also imperative from a physical perspective. As the tides rise, more and more land is inundated, not only by the tide itself, but by increased runoff due to climate change and the inability of the drainage system to handle those flows as capacity is lost to increasingly backwatered systems in the low-lying areas. So we really need to look at things topographically and identify where are the areas that local projects can work, like drainage system improvements, and where are the areas of natural high ground we can tie into as a region, and let those topographic characteristics suggest our planning opportunities. In San Mateo County along the Bay Shore, the natural high ground to the north is Oyster Point at South San Francisco, and to the south in the city of San Mateo, it's somewhere around Coyote Point. And everywhere in between, if we raise the shoreline in isolation, the bay is just going to end around the protection and flood the low-lying areas. So for our area, South San Francisco, SFO, San Bruno, Burlingame, and Millbrae all need to build up their shorelines together. So when the county developed its countywide sea level rise vulnerability assessment, the natural next step was to offer a grant to local entities to build on that with local level studies. Now, SFO has been working on preparing for sea level rise for years with a view to removing its property from the FEMA flood insurance study. One challenge they're facing is that without a regional project, they need to build a long section of levee along the land side of their property to make them into an island. With grant funding from the county, both Burlingame and Millbrae were able to start looking at not only better understanding what was at risk in their areas, but also what local and regional efforts should be identified as next steps. The best part of these studies was that they took place concurrently, so there were opportunities to work together in defining the planning approach and potential adaptation measures. So what's at risk? Well, a lot of things. We aren't just talking about the airport, which is huge, but local services like water, wastewater, and drainage systems, and electrical and gas infrastructure, freeways, and intermodal transit that serves the entire region. So when we're talking about the cost of inaction, we're not just talking about the loss of the land or the loss of the services to the upland areas of town outside the inundated area, but impacts to the entire region that quickly become difficult to quantify because they're not just financial. These areas along the shoreline really do define for many people what it means to live in this area. So there are really 4 categories we can think of when it comes to adaptation that allow us to think in different ways about different types and scales of problems. Structural solutions involve placement of new infrastructure or infrastructure improvements, whereas non-structural options may be more nature-based or provide better planning and funding mechanisms. Local projects are those that might be implemented by a single asset owner, whereas larger scale projects require multiple jurisdictions to get involved. So we're going to dive into some of those now. Starting with some local structural concepts, each city identified interior drainage improvements that should take place in tandem with work on larger regional solutions. These included raising the height of the canals that drain to the bay and providing pumping to move runoff over the future higher shoreline. When part of a larger vision, these projects can contribute to the success of the regional project by providing capacity to move the local runoff to the bay, and they can create efficiencies in the larger project. Local non-structural measures might include things like integrating local planning documents, clarifying or updating regulations on development to reduce risks, and guiding policy in the upper watershed to reduce future runoff to mitigate combined flooding. When it comes to hauling out the big guns, there's no answer to 10 feet above today's high tide like raising the shoreline. How and how much varies, but some of the concepts that cities are considering include levees, flood walls, and sheet pilings. When it comes to levees, not all are created equal. In the Bay Area, foundation soils are a concern, and lightweight levees have been successfully used in places like Foster City to the south to address these concerns. Levees may also offer a unique opportunity to increase the height of the shoreline in a phased manner, where an interim height is achieved by a levee with a flood wall later added on top as the need develops. A gradual change may be more readily accepted and allow the communities to address the risks as they are realized and funding can be identified. Flood walls and sheet piles offer different sets of benefits, mainly around available space in an often highly developed shoreline area where it's desirable to minimize impacts to existing assets and local landowners. It's important to note that although there are challenges here to offering additional habitat in this region due to the proximity of SFO and the risk of bird strikes, there are a number of opportunities to integrate nature-based solutions into these shorelines. Thanks to the great work of the San Francisco Estuary Institute and the San Francisco Bay Area Planning and Urban Research Association, a variety of concepts have been identified for integrating natural value into the planned adaptations. Millbrae has existing tidal mudflats offshore that reduce wave energy and offer an appropriate place to add submerged aquatic vegetation like eelgrass. There are also several areas of Burlingame shoreline where rocky or shell shorelines or beaches are being considered. So the key is that even with a large regional shoreline project, it's not one size fits all. Each reach will present designers with unique challenges and opportunities to create a seamless, integrated flood protection, recreation, and habitat enhancement project. You can see the variety of concepts that have been discussed here, and the next phase of the project feasibility will begin to weigh which are the most viable and most desirable to the communities and the region as a whole. The bottom line is that inaction means lost land, lost revenue, and enormous regional impacts to infrastructure that serves the entire region. As an example, the City of Millbrae assessment identified at least $110 million of impacts from lost tax revenue to the city alone. Contrast that with the partial cost of mitigation estimated at $70 million, and you can see that there is not only an imperative to save the cities for their unique value to residents, but a financial incentive to take the first steps toward action now. And that's one of our key messages to those working on addressing sea level rise and climate change. It's possible to be held hostage by uncertainty with ever-evolving predictions of future climate change and local and regional impacts. But choosing a target and beginning to act allows adaptations to be refined without holding back progress. The Millbrae and Burlingame assessments, along with SFO's Shoreline Protection Project, have laid a foundation. Generally, as these projects evolve, more voices speaking together in consensus will mean better projects. Better projects mean more funding, and more funding will allow refinement of the efforts moving forward. The next steps are to identify and fill data gaps and determine feasible approaches for a larger project that takes action on the recommendations that came out of the local assessments. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Len to talk about the role of the San Mateo Flood and Sea Level Rise Resiliency District in taking the next steps as a region.
Thank you, Millie. Appreciate that. Now I'm going to turn our attention to how our countywide climate resilience agency takes an approach to its projects and what it takes to implement these projects. Our first project under construction will begin construction at the end of this month, and our other projects are in planning and design. So in addition to establishing the well-defined need, as I discussed previously during this presentation, we want to establish a technically sound plan. And we hire many of the consultants that you all do in terms of engineering and biology and hydrology and all those issues to develop a technically sound plan that incorporates benefits to all the jurisdictions that are part of each multi-jurisdictional project. It takes, of course, political will and strong leadership from elected officials at many levels. I said that too in terms of the creation of the district, but it also needs to occur in terms of projects. Frequently, these jurisdictions, no matter how much external funding you get, these jurisdictions are required to put in some funding as a local match. Of course, land deals and land development play into these projects, as I'll talk about later. It also requires permits, and the permitting challenges in California are probably as great as they are in any jurisdiction, any state, and they're complicated. It takes financial resources and that's from both the local, the state, the federal, and the private sectors. That's our approach. And then land rights, and in utilizing private lands and public lands towards these public goods projects. So the countywide district began on January 1, 2020. I mentioned that previously. And it's the first of its kind on the West Coast in terms of a independent government agency dedicated to climate resilience. Our issue happens to be water, and we're working very closely with the government agencies within the county that also address fire issues. So we're taking a fire and water approach in terms of climate resilience for the county. But our district is on water, and as I mentioned before, all 20 cities as well as the county are contributing our operating funds and some project funds, although project funds also come from other sources. And they're contributing kind of the startup funding. And so what that means is really our first about 5 years of operations, almost 5 years, are being covered by local funds. And it was important to us to have all 20 cities, all of the cities within the county at the table in terms of funding. In 2019, there was the development of the agreements and the state legislation, which was required to start up a new so-called special district in California that was signed by our governor. And then in 2020, January 1, 2020, the district began operating. And in 2021, we have a program that for countywide work. We looked at many funding options in terms of both operating and project revenue. Here's just a list of many of them that we looked at. Some of them were kind of tried and true approaches in terms of grant funding and tax increases, and some of them were maybe non-traditional in terms of looking at insurance and how the protection of some of the high-value assets within the county and that capital of those assets can be translated into projects to protect that capital. Also green bonds, and you see here some of the other options that we looked at. Our district takes a holistic approach to its work. We're looking at the threat holistically, meaning not just kind of the storms that the flood control districts used to look at, but also looking at major storms during an era of climate change, and what is an increase in the severity of a storm, but maybe less frequent storms. What does that look like in California, and how do we factor that into flood protection? We also are looking at sea level rise, as I mentioned, and our objective is 10 feet above the current high tide. We're taking a holistic approach to the objectives, not just looking at reducing the threats that are listed in the first bullet, but also turning our waterways and shorelines from what had been liabilities into assets, so that they're integrated within their communities, that they're part of their community's general plans for the future, that we look at nature-based infrastructure, and that, as I mentioned before, public and private lands. So multiple objectives, a holistic approach to objectives, and then a holistic approach to geography, where we achieve those objectives by working with multiple jurisdictions at the same time. We're not as concerned about jurisdictional boundaries, and that's, we think, a better approach to deal with this substantial threat. The next steps for the partnership on this project, and this shows San Francisco Airport, the city of Millbrae, the city of Burlingame, and the FEMA floodplain. The FEMA floodplain is actually a pretty good area now, but what this shows is the FEMA floodplain about 10 feet higher than today's high tide, or about 6 feet higher than the FEMA floodplain. So anyway, we're trying to protect all the areas that are in blue. That orange line is the rail tracks for Caltrain, which goes up and down the peninsula, as well as BART, which is also a regional transportation system, public transit. And then there's Highway 101 and SFO, so major infrastructure in addition to water treatment and all kinds of community assets. So the project footprint is about 1.5 miles of shoreline and 1.5 miles of creeks, extending up to the train tracks, and and the reach of the bay tide after sea level rise. And that's it. Thank you very much. We would be very glad to talk to you after the session and during the conference. You can also reach us at One Shoreline. Our website is oneshoreline.org. There's the email address, info@oneshoreline. And here's the URLs for the other efforts in the county-wide effort on sea level rise, as well as the adaptation plans for Millbrae and Burlingame. And thanks to Millie for bringing this together. And both Millie and I would be happy to answer your questions now.
Thanks, Millie and Len. And I'm going to have to apologize to Millie. I butchered her company name. It's Woodard, not Woodward. Because I grew up in Detroit on a street called Woodward, and I always keep.
No problem, Dave.
But thanks, Millie and Len. We do have some questions for you guys. An excellent presentation. The first one is, how do you balance the needs of larger versus smaller partners in a project like this?
Len, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can. Thanks, Dave. I guess I wouldn't think of it as balancing the needs. I'd think of it as how do they both achieve their objectives. And sometimes bigger communities or partners have bigger or different objectives. And we work with both to see what their goals are for their community and how the project can achieve those goals. So sometimes, they'll have a particular financial or ecological asset that is on their shoreline or adjacent to a creek or whatnot, or a neighborhood of homeowners that are in the floodplain, something like that. And so it's really just kind of looking at what are their risks, what are their priorities, and balancing those, if you will.
Thank you very much. Anything you wanted to add to that, Millie?
No, I think Glenn really nailed it, because one of the great things about this collaboration has been the ability to really bring everybody to the table and start the dialogue early, so that I think we all understood what people's needs were. And Len and team at the county and at One Shoreline have done a good job of kind of bringing those needs to the table when formulating the project.
All right, another question we have here is, how do you suggest communities come to a consensus about the risks in choosing a planning target?
I'll start off, Millie. So I would say that we have a consensus on the risks. There's not a big discussion about sea level rise, and because there's 125 years of history on that, and we're in this area, we're pretty convinced that it's going to be accelerated. In terms of the objectives, I'm not sure that we need consensus on all of the objectives. We just need to understand what our priorities are again, and what our insecurities are. And so, sometimes there's financial issues or vulnerabilities or insecurities, and sometimes there's just the anxiety over what climate change will bring. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to build confidence that we're addressing both of those issues, the kind of on the ground issues and the uncertainties. And so I see our communications about whether it's achieving protection relative to the FEMA floodplain or protection relative to the daily high tide, which I think the public has a better handle on what the level of that is. Kind of that's where our work lies, is figuring out who's our audience and how do we communicate it so that they all understand and appreciate the objectives of the project, and that they have confidence that their anxiety about the future, which we all have relative to climate change, can be reduced.
Yeah, and I think, there's been a lot of talk at the conference so far about this, need to pick a target to plan to, and the challenges around that. How do you worry about the science of what's going to happen in the future? And, one of the things we've talked about a lot is, being able to not be frozen by that, not having perfection be the enemy of doing something good and getting in your way. And I think that, it worked out really well on this project to have a previous study nearby, and a couple of instances where we could say, hey, let's key into that. Let's not go back and reinvent the wheel, but let's take that and move forward. So I think that that's kind of one of our key messages for everybody is, pick something and, you can adapt in the future. But if you don't start, you got nothing.
And when you pick something that's substantial. Don't lowball it. I don't hear as different studies come out. I don't hear any new studies that are coming out saying, "Oops, we actually think it's going to be less sea level rise." And so, don't regret your decisions now. In 10 years, if you start build a project that you didn't achieve the objectives that you'll need, but be aggressive on these risks and assumptions.
Yeah, and I got that kind of leads into this next question, because having worked in the city of Milwaukee and for a sewer agency, I think this question is asking, there was a lot more gray infrastructure than green in certain parts of the projects, and then it talks about except for those measures to address stormwater in the uplands. And I know, like in Milwaukee, we had a lot of public infrastructure and actually economic infrastructure to protect. So there's always a balance between gray and green infrastructure. Could you kind of elaborate on that?
Well, in this area, one of our great limitations on green infrastructure is an international airport right there. And concerns about developing new habitat that would encourage birds to locate right adjacent to the runways. And so, other than that, I think there are things that we can do that we're exploring, and Millie touched on some of those in her part of the presentation. And it's just the same limitations everybody has in terms of habitat, developed areas, and how do you achieve your objectives for flood protection as you first and foremost look for natural solutions, and then revert to more gray solutions if you don't have the space or the land rights or other limitations.
Yeah, I think we're definitely looking for opportunities to incorporate where we can, right? And SFEI did such a good job of looking at what they thought those opportunities should be and should be considered. So we had this nice palette available of options to look at and, consider the ups and downs of, what benefits would this bring and what would be the challenges to this. And, in the Bay, there are so many considerations with adding any fill to the Bay, right? And getting things permitted can be more challenging, but we think we've got, at least some things to look at further as we move forward at this point.
We got one more question here. It says, great work. In terms of the greater region, what is the county doing to collaborate with other jurisdictions in the San Francisco Bay Area open coast?
Yeah, so I talk pretty regularly with counterparts in other counties around San Francisco Bay, and we're looking at funding some joint research to look at kind of what are the impacts if you do something on one side of the bay to the other side of the bay, and how do we complement each other's work on the ecological sense. So there is collaboration. There's probably room for improvement on that, but we're definitely there in terms of talking.
But you know how it is, right? With our discipline, everybody talks. So we all talk to each other about what's going on and what the best approaches are and lessons learned. So.
And one last question. Have you found your audience has changed with evolving generations, or are the same people at the table?
That's a constant problem of trying to grow the audience and grow the involvement. There's a lot of work being done right now in the San Francisco Bay Area regarding environmental justice and bringing in communities that traditionally have not been at the table in regards to flooding and environmental work. But there's a lot of room for improvement. And so I think all of us are trying. The universities here, the major universities here, Stanford, Berkeley, are part of that process of bringing in collaborators, but there's a lot more work to be done.
Anything to add, Millie?
Well, there's been a lot of outreach with the previous studies. And I think one of the things that the county did really well when kicking off this effort a few years back was to have these big countywide collaborative meetings. And they put a lot of effort to getting stakeholders to a table, talking with one another, and really cross-pollinating ideas about how to address climate change. So I think that work is happening, but obviously, it's ongoing.
Well, thank you very much. I don't see any more questions in the queue. So again, fabulous presentation. I look forward to coming out to San Francisco at some time and seeing all this really great work that's being done out there. So
Sounds
thanks
good.
again, Millie and Len. Really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave.
That is the end of our session. Thank you for attending this session, and I want to encourage you, the conference is not over yet, so please go and visit the exhibit hall and see the different exhibit booths that have been prepared virtually. It's kind of an interesting walk through. It's not quite what it is when you're not live, but the virtual experience is quite interesting, at least for me. Also, I would encourage you to go to the Flood Science Center booth from ASFPM because we are offering a $200 discount for the Orlando conference. So if you want to get on that raffle, you've got to go to the Flood Science Center and sign up for the raffle. And I highly encourage you to do that. So again, thanks for attending, and I look forward to seeing you in Orlando or in the exhibit hall. Thank you. Bye-bye.